It was one of those lazy Saturday afternoons where nothing seems urgent, yet everything feels heavy. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I had been avoiding chores, scrolling through my phone aimlessly, when I remembered a USB drive I needed for a project. I figured it would be in Dad's office, a small, cluttered room where old papers, half-read books, and dusty electronics seemed to live forever. That's when my eyes landed on his old laptop. It was unusual to see it out of its drawer, as if the machine had been waiting, almost expectantly, for me. Curiosity, that dangerous little spark, nudged me toward it. I hesitated. I knew better than to snoop into his files. He valued privacy like a sacred law. But there was something about the quiet hum of that old device that made me forget caution. I clicked it on. Windows groaned as it started, and memories of watching him work, lost in thought, flooded me. My attention drifted until a folder caught my eye, buried deep in a directory I had never seen. It was named simply Memories. No one had ever mentioned this folder before. It wasn't on the desktop or even in documents. It was hidden, subtle, private. My hand hovered over the mouse, heart thudding against my ribs. I hesitated. Should I open it? But curiosity had its way of overpowering reason. With a trembling double click, I opened the folder. Inside the first file was a photo. I froze. My stomach sank in a sudden, heavy wave. The photo showed a little girl, no more than 5 years old, laughing under a warm, golden sunset. Her curls bounced freely, her eyes sparkling with an innocence that made my chest tighten. And then I noticed who was holding her. It was Dad, but not the Dad I knew. His face, younger, unlined by time, glowed with a pure, quiet joy. He cradled her gently in his arms, his smile soft but full of love. It was a perfect, candid moment, something out of a storybook. And yet, I had never seen this child before. Never. The shock hit me in waves. Who was she? Why had he never told me about her? 1,000 questions flooded my mind. Was she a sibling I never knew? A niece? Or someone else entirely? Someone he had loved but couldn't keep close. I stared at the image, heart pounding, realizing that my dad had an entire life I didn't know about. A hidden life filled with emotions I couldn't touch, grief I couldn't comprehend. And that first photo, it broke something inside me. I closed the folder reflexively, but the questions kept spinning in my mind. My dad had always been private, even reserved. He never shared much about his past, about his struggles or his regrets. I had thought that was just the way he was. A quiet, stoic man who preferred to live in his own world. Now I realized I had been wrong. There was more, so much more. I wanted to ask him everything at once, to demand answers, to make sense of the puzzle I had just uncovered. But the very idea of asking felt like betrayal. Some doors are meant to be opened only when the time is right. Instead, I found myself scrolling further through the folder. Every click revealed more: photos, letters, scanned notes, fragments of a life that seemed to have existed in parallel to the one I knew. And with every new file, my chest tightened, and the weight of silent grief settled over me like a fog. As I explored, the folder began to tell a story: birthdays, holidays, school events, moments frozen in time, smiles captured on film, all featuring the little girl and my dad. She grew older in each photo, her personality blossoming, her laughter evident even in still images. The strangest part was realizing that these memories were real, tangible, and yet entirely hidden from me. A whole life, lived side by side with my father, had existed without my knowledge. He had loved and cared, documented and remembered, all while keeping it a secret. The folder wasn't just an archive, it was a window into a part of him I had never imagined. And with each photo, each file, I felt more distant from the father I thought I knew, yet strangely closer because I was beginning to see his heart. Then I saw a photograph that stopped me cold. A handmade birthday card, folded and worn with age, filled with messy handwriting. "I miss you, Daddy. Come home soon." The words were simple, but the longing behind them was anything but. I felt my throat tighten. The girl had been waiting, hoping, missing him, and he had been absent. My dad, who I had always known to be responsible and dependable, had failed to be there in ways I couldn't yet understand. It made me ache. Why hadn't he told me about her? Why had this child been left alone? The folder seemed to pulse with quiet sorrow, each image a reminder of love interrupted, life interrupted, moments that could never be reclaimed. Another image appeared, and this one broke me even more. It was Dad, older than in the first picture, but still younger than I remembered, sitting alone on a park bench. Beside him was a small, empty chair. He wasn't smiling. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on his knees, and his eyes I had never seen like this, were red, filled with grief. I could almost hear the silence surrounding him. The photo screamed absence, loss, a grief that was profound and heavy. Somehow, in one simple image, my father had revealed a pain he had carried alone. The folder was more than pictures. There were letters, long, painstakingly written letters to an email address I didn't recognize. Each one was filled with apologies, confessions, promises of love, and regrets for absence. I read one aloud, my voice barely a whisper. "I will always love you, even if I cannot be there. Please forgive me someday." It was heart-wrenching. I felt like a stranger, intruding on a life that belonged only to my father and this mysterious child. Yet, at the same time, I felt closer to him than ever, understanding a depth of emotion I had never seen. Eventually, I found a document titled, "For When You're Ready." My hands shook as I opened it. It was a confession, written with painstaking honesty. "There's someone I loved more than anything. I had to let her go to keep her safe. I hope one day you'll understand why I couldn't tell you." The words hit me like a thunderclap. My father had sacrificed, concealed, and suffered alone, all for someone else's well-being. The weight of his silent love pressed down on me, heavy and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. A photograph followed, more recent than the others. Dad, standing outside a hospital, holding a tiny hand. The caption read, "First day she came into my life." I realized, with a mixture of awe and pain, that this little girl had been a real, living person in his world. Every letter, every photo, every voice note, they were all pieces of a story he had lived in secret, and one I had stumbled into entirely by accident. For the first time, I began to see my father not as the man who occasionally seemed distant, or who scolded too quickly, or who seemed too serious. I saw him as someone who had loved with fierce intensity, even if that love could never be openly expressed. The weight he had carried alone, grief, loss, responsibility, heartbreak, was almost heroic in its quiet resilience. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger at his secrecy. I felt awe, compassion, and a growing understanding of the man who had given me everything, even while hiding a life he had cherished deeply. Seeing her name felt surreal, like discovering a missing piece of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. Each letter in that name carried weight, a story, and a history that my dad had held close to his chest for years. Suddenly, the photos, the letters, the voice notes, they were no longer abstract pieces of memory. They belonged to a real person, a living being whom my dad had loved fiercely. My heart ached with empathy. He had sacrificed so much, carried invisible burdens, and protected someone else's happiness over his own. Understanding this made me see my father in a new light. The man I had sometimes thought of as distant, sometimes frustrating, had lived a life of deep love, heartbreak, and courage. And in a strange way, discovering Ella's existence made me feel closer to him, even though he had never shared her with me. The days that followed were strange. I didn't confront him about the folder. I didn't mention Ella. But I started watching him differently, not with judgment, but with curiosity, respect, and newfound empathy. I noticed little things, how he paused when he thought no one was watching, staring at old postcards and photographs, how he sometimes hummed softly to himself, lost in memory, the quiet sadness in his eyes, barely noticeable. But there, I realized then that people carry entire worlds inside them, hidden layers of love, grief, and sacrifice. And sometimes understanding those layers requires patience, observation, and respect for silence. One evening, while helping him clean the office, I found a small stuffed bear tucked in the back of a shelf. It was dusty and worn, but clearly cherished. My heart skipped a beat. I recognized it immediately from the photos. Ella's bear. My father had kept it all these years. The evidence of his quiet devotion was tangible, almost sacred. He had loved her without expectation, without recognition, and even without presence. Yet the care remained. In that moment, I realized love isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers in objects, in gestures, in memories preserved quietly for years. I discovered that on what would have been Ella's birthday each year, my father quietly revisited the folder. He stared at her photos, whispered her name, sometimes leaving small notes or letters he never sent. The realization twisted my heart. He had never stopped celebrating her. Even after all these years, even though she was gone or unreachable, his love remained steadfast. It struck me that devotion isn't measured by presence. Sometimes it's measured by the courage to remember, honor, and protect the memory of someone you love, even in silence. Then I found a voice note. Ella's tiny voice, recorded years ago. "I love you, Daddy. Don't cry. I'll come back." And then, faintly, my father's reply. A quiet, broken whisper, filled with tears I had never seen. My stoic, silent father, the one I'd always assumed was unshakable, was capable of heartbreak so deep it was almost unbearable to hear. I realized then that grief and love are not opposites. They coexist, inseparable, shaping the human heart in ways that can never be erased. I began to understand something fundamental. Life is messy, painful, and unpredictable. But the measure of a person isn't in perfection. It's in how deeply they love, how courageously they bear pain, and how selflessly they sacrifice. My father had carried this entire story, this lifelong grief and love, without ever asking for recognition or sympathy. And through it, I saw a man stronger, braver, and more tender than I had ever realized. It made all my petty frustrations, my small complaints about him, seem trivial. Finally, one quiet evening, I decided to talk to him. Not about the folder, not about Ella directly, but about the life he had lived before me. Dad, I said cautiously, why didn't you ever tell me about life before me? He sighed, a mixture of sorrow and relief passing over his face. I wanted to protect you from pain. Some wounds are too heavy to carry for two people, he said softly. And in that moment, I realized that love sometimes speaks not through words, but through restraint, through sacrifice, and through silent endurance. Weeks later, I decided to clear the folder from the computer, but I didn't erase the memories from my heart. The photos, letters, and voice notes stayed with me, etched in my mind, a testament to love, resilience, and unspoken devotion. I realized that sometimes letting go isn't about forgetting. It's about honoring, remembering, and carrying forward the lessons hidden in someone else's pain. I wrote a letter to Ella, though I didn't know if she'd ever read it. I told her about my father, about the quiet heroism of his love, about the sacrifices he made for her happiness. I wrote that she was loved, deeply and unconditionally, even from a distance. And as I finished, I felt a strange, bittersweet closure. Love, I realized, doesn't need presents to be real. Its proof lies in the hearts it shapes, the lives it touches, and the memories it preserves. Years later, I often find myself smiling at memories of my father and Ella, imagining her laughter echoing through our lives. The hidden folder, once a source of shock, had become a source of wisdom, reflection, and gratitude. I learned that the greatest stories aren't always told aloud. They are felt quietly, in the spaces between heartbeats, in memories preserved, sacrifices made, and love given unconditionally. And in that quiet, I found hope, healing, and a deeper love for the man I had always called Dad.